This is Akashwani. Time for a weekly program, Our Guest. I hand over the mic to the show host, Nitish Arora, for the same.
Good morning and welcome to Our Guest. Today is International Day of UN Peacekeepers. The International Day of United Nations Peacekeepers is an international day to pay tribute to all the men and women who have served and continue to serve in United Nations peacekeeping operations for their high level of professionalism, dedication and courage, and to honor the memory of those who have lost their lives in the cause of peace. Every day, United Nations peacekeepers work to protect hundreds of thousands of vulnerable people in the world's most fragile political and security situations. This year, the United Nations will mark the occasion under the theme People, Peace, Progress, the Power of Partnerships. It is in this context that we have invited Dr. Manish Dabhade from the School of International Studies, JNU, to talk in detail about this very important arm of the United Nations. Dr. Dabhade, welcome to our guest. UN Peacekeeping Day. What is this concept of peacekeeping forces by United Nations, and when did this idea germinate?
It came out immediately with the formation of the United Nations way back in 1945. The idea is that states, we live in a society of states, and there is going to be international conflict within the states and within and between the states. So UN, in fact, through the UN peacekeeping missions, actually sees this as one of its very primary objectives. If you look at the UN Charter, one of the core principles of the UN Charter is the preservation of international peace and security, and UN peacekeeping is in fact the most important way in which this can be looked at. In fact, peacekeeping, in the words of current UN General Assembly President, is international solidarity in its truest forms. So in fact, UN peacekeeping forces are seen as the human face of the UN.
So how do and when do these troops, the UN peacekeeping troops, they step in? There are conflict zones all over the world. There must be some specific point of time when United Nations peacekeeping force intervenes.
The basic mission of a UN peacekeeping force is to really stabilize the conflict and look at it that how does one transit in that conflict zone from a war to peace and prosperity. The UN peacekeeping force actually is completely and only happens when it is mandated by the UN Security Council. So it's only when the United Security Council comes together and really approves of this mandate, then the UN peacekeeping mission goes in those conflict zones. So it's only after that. For example, today there are 12 active UN peacekeeping missions in different parts of, but largely in Africa, but also in Asia.
So what is the selection procedure? How does United Nations selects that we have to draw troops from a specific nation for a UN peacekeeping mission?
It is a voluntary exercise. It is in fact they are called blue helmets popularly, and it is completely they approach. In fact, the conflictual parties approach the UN Secretariat, and typically then the United Nations Secretary General in fact invites contributions from member states to participate in such missions. So it is an entirely voluntary effort by member states of the United Nations.
So we find that there are certain nations which are contributing troops in a large number, and there are certain nations which are like keeping aloof. So
absolutely, and in fact there is one can see a pattern in some ways that the richer member states of the United Nations in fact foot the bill, because it is really a very costly exercise. So you see that they pay with US dollars, and countries who really contribute, they in fact many a times pay with their own blood. So in that sense there is really a sort of not exactly a division of labor, but you see the larger contributions in fact come from the developing countries, which are now called the global south. In fact, Bangladesh has, if you look at the 2023 figures, Bangladesh is really topping in terms of troop contributions, followed by Nepal, and then India is the third largest contributor to UN peacekeeping.
So we all in neighborhood are like trying to keep peace all over the world.
Absolutely.
UN peacekeeping forces, they marshal themselves into a conflict zone. What specifically are their roles?
They have a very specific mandate which is again passed by the UN Security Council. But the principal job is that they have to stabilize the conflict. So it's not just peacekeeping, it's also peace building. And then it involves obviously building infrastructure, it also involves medical services, it also involves training civilian population, training civilian administration.
So, how do and when do they pull out? Because you've entered into a conflict zone, and obviously, the warring nations they are depleted in all kind of resources, and they would want that the peacekeeping mission goes on and building their infrastructure and doing all those things, but it cannot be endless. So, how do they come out?
Though they come with a very specific mandate to operate in a specific conflict zone, there is, in fact, one of the major criticisms by scholars and also people who are military personnel who have been involved, or even member states like India who have been involved in UN peacekeeping missions. The major criticism is that there is no properly drafted or properly created exit strategy, and in fact that is also creating problems in implementing the mandate. So there at times, and again it's an evolving situation. I mean, you just cannot there is a genuine problem also that you cannot enter into a conflict zone and expect that within next 30, 60 days or 90 days it will end. It is a gradual evolutionary process. It involves active engagement with local population. It also involves, obviously, most importantly, active engagement with even conflicting parties. At times, they are interested also in promoting the peace, and if peace can be held by such forces, there is also an incentive to really prolong that stay for a much longer time. In many cases, we have also seen that the moment UN peacekeeping forces have pulled out, the conflict has again resumed. So that remains a challenge. But again, it depends on the situation and the assessment of at the ground level.
Any such conflict zones where the United Nations peacekeeping movement have actually brought in stabilization and they have come out?
So there are many. If you look at in West Asia, in Korea, in Congo, then in Liberia, these are all have been successful examples where the UN peacekeeping missions have come in, have done their job successfully, and have pulled out. In fact, that is a very important template and a very important, in fact, goal of the United Nations, which they have fulfilled through the UN peacekeeping missions.
Coming to India, India has always been the largest contributor to UN peacekeeping missions and forces. How does the United Nations and the other nations look at India's role in it?
This is a very good question. And in fact, India, as I said earlier, is the third largest troop contributor. So 6,000 plus as of now who are in different missions. And till now, in fact, if you look at the entire history, 2,60,000 plus personnel, Indian personnel, military and civil and police personnel have served in different missions. And in fact, if you go to the basic philosophy, is India is the founder member of the United Nations in 1945, and in fact the first mission, India was part of the first mission in 1948, which overlooked the conflict over Israel in the Middle East. The basic philosophy is that India sees itself as a responsible power, as a responsible state, and in fact when it looks at the UN Charter, looks at the UN objective of peace and security, India sees that as a public good, and as a very responsible stakeholder, as a responsible nation, India should be contributing to that global effort. So India looks at it that way, goes into our Indian basic civilizational ethos about Vasudeva Kutumbakam, that the world is one family, and if there is any problem, it is the job of a state to really help our international brothers and sisters. So that is the basic philosophy which drives India to take part in such missions. The second part of your question is how is Indian contribution look in the UN peacekeeping? Here you see a very important thread that India, because it's a democracy and because there is a respect of rule of law, that there is a genuine appreciation. The military personnel who are going, the police personnel who take part in such missions are really the best and the brightest of the Indian Armed Forces. For example, you had General Thimaiya in his early days was part of the UN peacekeeping mission, who really became the chief of armed forces later. Then you have the latest one being was General Bipin Rawat. So it's really India's best and the really the best and the brightest in the armed forces going and doing it. Same with Dr. Kiran Bedi. She also took part in the mission in Liberia. So that is where in fact they have made names there, and then in fact they have come back here and shared those experiences and have really risen to the top positions in their respective professions. So I think that is a very important learning experience. And India obviously, because of their professionalism, the sense of discipline, so those values are very much appreciated by UN member states, specifically in the UN peacekeeping missions.
And we have women soldiers also. Not many nations can contribute the women forces.
Absolutely, I think that that is something very historic, and that shows how India takes this enterprise of UN peacekeeping very seriously. That in fact, this is not something which is a recent phenomena. In 2007, we had all India women platoon, in fact, taking part in Liberia security. I mean, in the UN peacekeeping mission, where in fact you have the women participating in guarding the palace of the president, then conducting elections. And in fact, you have, I mean, they went inside in 2007 and 2015-16. In fact, the Liberian president, a female herself, she in fact openly and publicly appreciated the all female, all women participation in the UN peacekeeping mission, because that, in fact, she said that it really brought out a model for Liberian women, that okay, they can also be part of the national development and also the national security structure. I think that is the sort of image, that is the sort of work, extremely exemplary work, which the UN peacekeeping missions have done, and especially with women. In fact, now, I mean, in this year also, you have a women platoon, in fact, going to South Sudan as part of the UN peacekeeping mission.
Many nations right now after the COVID pandemic, they are on shaky economic grounds. And the world, if we look at it now, there are so many conflict zones. How do you perceive the role of UN peacekeeping forces in the days to come?
The level of conflict, the nature of conflict, the use of technology in conflicts now. So I think that has put up enormous strain on the peacekeeping mandate itself. And now increasingly states are looking at it to really, in fact, increase their own competence, increase their own skill sets, and really diversifying from not just peacekeeping but to increasingly peace building. So I think that dramatic change has happened, and because peace building involves much more than just keeping the conflictual parties at bay. It really now involves more and more use of technology, more and more use of logistics, more and more about building hospitals, about building infrastructure, about in fact also ensuring democratic processes, involving in fact the local population in a much larger, bigger way, and generating a sense of confidence and security amongst themselves. So I think that in that sense the operational mandate has actually increased much larger because of the growing distress, as you rightly pointed out, because of the COVID years. There is lots of economic anxieties. So I think that is really creating those avenues where UN peacekeeping missions can play a very important role. And again, here women in fact are also encouraged. When women go in UN peacekeeping, especially in these times, you see that they are playing a much more role of as a soothing sort of in those specific societies where they reach out more actively to women and children, in fact, who are most affected by conflicts. So that is a very important change which you are witnessing in terms of UN peacekeeping missions.
We have covered largely most aspect of this particular day. Is there anything specific that you want to let our listeners know?
As I said, I mean, how India is now looking at it, India is looking at UN peacekeeping missions are being now more agile, more nimble, and in fact increasing the use of technology. I think that element has come very new. That is a new part of UN peacekeeping now. And in India, there is a USI, which is the United Services Institution of India, which is the oldest think tank, armed forces think tank of the country. In fact, they have started a center for UN peacekeeping, where India is now training its own personnel personnel who go for such missions, but not just Indian soldiers or Indian police personnel, but you have even now participation from partner countries who are now getting training about the UN peacekeeping operations very much in Delhi. So I think that is India in fact has emerged as a leader. I think that's a very welcome change.
Well, the nation is realizing its role in the international community. Dr. Dabhade, thank you so much for being our guest this morning. That was Dr. Manish Dabhade from the School of International Studies, JNU, talking about the International Day of United Nations Peacekeepers.
You were listening to the weekly program Our Guest that is broadcast every Monday at 9:15 a.m. Don't forget to tune in next week, same day, same time and same frequency.